Classical conditioning has to deal with the involuntary reflex-like response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces the response. Pictured above is the Pavlov's experience of the salivating dog. During Pavlov's experience, he identified several key elements that must be present and experienced in a particular way for conditioning to take place. You have your unconditioned stimulus, your unconditioned response, your conditioned stimulus, your neutral stimulus, your unconditioned stimulus, and finally you have your conditioned response. I'm now going to go over the 6 different stimuluses you have to have in order to have classical conditioning performed. The original naturally occurring stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus. The term unconditioned means unlearned. This is the stimulus that ordinarily leads to the involuntary response. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, the food is the unconditioned stimulus throughout this project. Next, we have the automatic and involuntary response to the unconditioned stimulus. This is called the unconditioned response, for much of the same reason. It is unlearned and occurs because of the genetic wiring in the nervous system. For example, in Pavlov's experience, the salivation to the food is the unconditioned response. Pavlov determined that almost any kind of stimulus could become associated with the unconditioned stimulus, if it is paired with it enough. In his original study, the sight of food, the food dish itself became a stimulus salivation before the food was given to the dogs. Every time they got food, to which they automatically salivated, they saw the dish. At this point, the dish was the neutral stimulus because it had no effect on salivation. After being paired with the food so many times, the dish became to produce a salivation response, although a somewhat weaker one as the food did itself. When a previously neutral stimulus through the repeated pairing, when the unconditioned stimulus begins to cause the same kind of involuntary response, learning has occurred. The previously neutral stimulus can now be called a conditioned stimulus. Conditional meaning learned. The response that is given to the conditioned stimulus is not usually quite as strong as the original unconditioned response, but is essentially the same response. However, it becomes a learned response to the conditioned stimulus. This is called the conditioned response. The best known of Pavlov's experience involves the study of the salivation of the dogs. Pavlov was originally studying the saliva of dogs as related to digestion, but as he conducted his research, he noticed that the dogs would begin to salivate every time he entered the room, even if he had no food. The dogs were associating his entrance into the room with being fed. This led Pavlov to design a series of experiments in which he used various sounds, objects, such as buzzers, to condition the salivation in response to the dogs. He started by sounding a buzzer each time food was given to the dogs and found that these dogs would start salivating immediately after hearing the buzzer, even before seeing the food. After a period of time, Pavlov began sounding the buzzer without giving any food at all and found that the dogs continued to salivate at the sound of the buzzer, even with the absence of the food. They had learned to associate the sound of the buzzer with being fed. Pavlov's experiments identifies 4 of the classical condition factors in this work: the unconditioned response, which was the natural salivation of the dogs to seeing or smelling the food; the unconditioned stimulus, which was the sight of the smell of the food itself; the conditioned stimulus was the ringing of the bell, which previously had no association with the food; and the conditioned response, which was the salivation of the dogs in response to ringing the bell even when no food was present. Pavlov successfully associated an unconditioned response with a conditioned stimulus, eventually creating a conditioned response. With these results, Pavlov established his theory of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was initially discovered to be an effective method of learning in dogs. Since that time, numerous research studies have found classical conditioning to be effective in humans as well. John B. Walston conditioned a fear response in little Albert by banging a hammer on a metal pole every time Albert touched a white rat. Albert soon developed a conditioned fear response to rat as well as other similar furry objects. An adaptive mechanism, conditioning helps shield an individual from harm or prepare them for important biological events such as sexual activity. Classical conditioning is effective in a number of therapeutic treatments in humans, such as aversion therapy, sympathetic dissociation, and flooding. Classical conditioning is used not only in therapeutic interventions but in everyday life as well, such as advertising agencies. Classical conditioning is not only used in therapeutic interventions but everyday life as well. Advertising executives, for example, are adept to applying principles of associative learning. Think about a car commercial you've recently seen on television. Many of them feature an attractive model, right? By associating the model with the car being advertised, you come to see the car by being desirable. You may ask yourself, does this advertising technique actually work? According to a study of men who viewed a car commercial that included an attractive woman or man, later related to cars as being faster, more appealing, and better designed, and did not than did men who viewed advertisement for the same car without the model. So think about it. We use this in everyday life, and most of the time we don't even realize it. So this just proves to show classical conditioning is used not only in experiments but also in everyday life without us even knowing.